Hello, I'm Judy Lavoie. Welcome to Anatomy of a Watercolor, where I'm going to deconstruct one of my paintings to share a variety of watercolor techniques and tips that you might try in your own artwork. I chose my painting Sorghum Maker, which I created with transparent watercolors. I worked in the traditional method of allowing the white of the paper to be preserved as the whites in my painting. My paintings are primarily done from my own reference photos. I took this photo while visiting the Muddy Pond Sorghum Mill in Monterey, Tennessee, which is operated by a Mennonite family. Sorghum syrup is very similar to molasses. This sorghum making operation was very unusual and visually interesting to me. In this photo, the family patriarch is sitting next to a heavy-duty press and feeding the sorghum cane stalks into the iron machinery. The horse is attached to the long horizontal pole. As he walks in a circle around and around, the winding pole turns gears and the raw juice is squeezed out of the stalks. The liquid pours out into the 5-gallon bucket and the squeezed canes drop onto the ground. After making sure I was allowed to take photos, I took many reference shots from this distance and close up. I often combine several photographs to create a composition for my paintings, but this photo looked like it would work by itself. I liked the man's casual pose, the texture of his beard, the details and folds of his clothing, and the old rugged machinery. This close-up of his face shows lots of character and good lighting. The beard against the dark background would allow me to capture great detail and use strong value changes. I played around in Photoshop to decide how I could best crop the image, and I settled on this vertical format, focusing upon his face. The dark background would help me draw attention to the figure itself, while adding interest. It's helpful sometimes to look at the reference photo in black and white to get a better feel for the value changes from the whitest areas to the darkest. This image appears to have a good range of values, which makes for a strong painting. My favorite watercolor paper is 300-pound Arches brand. I prefer to work on this heavy, thick sheet because it stays flat when it's wet, without needing to stretch it or staple it to a board. I like the texture of the cold press surface shown at the top. Paints react to the painting surface, so it's worth experimenting to see which brand, weight, and surface texture work best for you. Like many longtime watercolor artists, I've got a collection of many brands and colors of paint. Two different brands of the exact same color will not necessarily be the same. One might be more transparent than the other, one might have a different tinting strength, etc. Color is a major component in a watercolor painting, so again, you should determine which work best for you. I often work with a limited palette of colors, meaning I select just a few tubes of paint and I mix them to create other colors, as opposed to using a couple of dozen tubes of paint. Limiting your palette will naturally create more harmony in the overall look of your painting. It helps avoid having a certain color stand out as not really fitting in with the rest. Years ago, I learned about using just 3 primary colors for a painting while using a pouring technique, and that showed me the beautiful range of colors they mix to create, as in this watercolor underwater scene. But it's not as simple as picking just any red, yellow, and blue. Here you can see that the yellow plus blue doesn't always make green. This yellow leans toward orange, so mixing it with blue creates a shade of brown, not green. But there is another lesson here. If you mix a more pure yellow with a pure blue, you will get green. But then if you add a touch of pure red, you'll be able to mix various shades of brown. By mixing various amounts of each primary color, you can create a wide range of bright or muted colors, even a rich black. So the specific choice of blue, red, and yellow pigments is important if you're working with a limited palette of just 3 primary colors. Here are 2 paintings in which I used 3 primary colors, each one done with a different selection. You can see that I've mixed the red, yellow, and blue paints to create a wide variety of other colors, including grays, greens, and browns. I've also used values of colors, from the darkest shadows and the dark lines in the bandana fabric shown on the left, to the lightest areas in the sky shown above the barn on the right. These paintings illustrate how you can use realistic colors just using the primaries. These 4 paintings were also done with 3 primary colors, and they all use the same 3 named here. In this case, I wasn't trying to mix the primaries into realistic hues. I allowed the 3 primaries to mix randomly on the paper, and they mixed to create a bright rainbow of colors. Here I relied primarily on different values to create the realistic images. It is also helpful to understand the difference between warm and cool colors. You can see from the 2 reds that the warm one is more orange and the cool one is more pink. The chart on the right shows warm and cool versions of each of the 3 primaries and of green. For the Sorghum Maker painting, I used colors suggested by a fellow watercolor artist whose award-winning portraits I love, Tuva Stevens. I used 3 warm primaries and 3 cool primaries. As I often do before using a new set of colors, I painted this swatch sheet to see how they look and to test mixing them into the secondary colors of orange, purple, and green. I also tested the ability to re-wet and lift the dry colors from the paper. This is a characteristic which varies among pigments. Contrary to what I would have guessed, the warm colors were suggested to be used for the shadow areas and the cool colors for highlighted areas. So that was my plan. I used these 2 small palettes and I labeled them just to help keep me straight. I usually start my paintings by transferring outlines of the major shapes onto the watercolor paper, as I did for this other painting. I do this by tracing an enlarged black and white printout of my reference photo over a sheet of graphite transfer paper. The graphite lines are like pencil marks, and they erase easily from the paper. So this is the same way I began Sorghum Maker. Here's a close-up of how I started on the man's face, where I've blended my colors on the palette and diluted the paints to get light and dark values. Can you see the difference between the warm and cool colors? I wanted a dark background to contrast with the figure, letting the colors and the textures suggest foliage without relying on making details. So I wet the paper in the top corner, carefully painting clear water to the edges of his hair and of the machinery. In this dampened area, I applied several colors to the paper and I allowed them to mix randomly. With my limited palette, the same colors will repeat in different parts of the painting, creating a visual unity. For added texture in this background, I sprinkled some table salt in a few places as the background colors began to dry. This creates random little sparkles as the salt crystals pull the water close and push the pigments away. Here's my progress so far. I used a tip from a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. By turning both your reference photo and your painting upside down, you can make your brain think less about correctly painting eyes, ears, and other features, and instead concentrate on the shapes and the value changes. I find using this technique gives me really good results when I'm trying to create a painting of a face, whether it's a person or an animal's face. It's a trick I use often. Here I've started to add some very light tints to the beard, as well as adding skin tones which show through his thin white hair. The ear was fun to paint in a way that made it look three-dimensional, which was primarily accomplished by getting the values right. The beard needed more light glazes of blue tones, and then I began to work on the fabric details in the blue overalls. Masking fluid can be used when you want to prevent parts of the white paper from being painted. Masking fluid is basically a liquid latex which dries as a water-resistant film. It seals your paper, and so it keeps the paints from penetrating where it covers. Here on the right you can see the masking fluid I applied on the dry paper before I began any painting. It shows here as a gray coating. Compare these areas to how they looked in the finished painting on the left. By the way, masking fluid will thicken when exposed to air, so I usually pour a small amount into a little cup to work from and keep the original bottle closed until I need more. With the masking fluid painted on, I could apply the three primary colors to the whole watercolor sheet and let them mingle randomly. You can see how the dry masking fluid resisted the paint, even making it bead up like rain on a waxed car. When everything's dry and it's time to remove the masking, I catch an edge of the piece with masking tape, and then it pulls off like an elastic band, revealing the beautiful unpainted white paper. Here's how my painting Bloodroot looked after letting the primary colors mix on the paper and preserving the whitest and lightest values. Masking fluid can ruin a brush, so only use it with old brushes. If you coat the bristles with liquid soap before dipping them in the masking fluid, it'll make cleanup easier. You can apply masking with whatever tool works best for you. For fine lines, I like to use these tips which attach to a little squeeze bottle and let you control the masking in detailed areas. I've also used the beveled end of a paintbrush to apply masking fluid, as well as using a pointed wooden skewer and a twig, and I've even dipped a lid into the masking fluid and then pressed it onto the paper to create a circle. Whatever works for you is fine. Here's a close-up of how I applied the masking fluid along the outer edges of the beard where the white hairs would show up against the dark piece of machinery and against the man's clothing. You'll notice that I didn't apply masking fluid until I had already done some painting, so it doesn't necessarily have to be at the start of your work. I applied the masking fluid here as if I was drawing random overlapping strokes. Before I painted the plaid pattern on the man's shirt, I made this test sheet to see how the transparent colors would blend when overlapped. I liked how the color changed where the vertical and horizontal lines intersected, letting these transparent colors show through each other and naturally mix. Then when I painted the plaid on the actual painting, the lines looked too stark and too bold. I wasn't sure what would be the best way to fix them. Sorry, but I was more intent on fixing the problem than photographing it, so I can't show you my dilemma. Anyway, I went back to my test sheet and I tried re-wetting the colors and blotting them off with a clean paper towel, as you can see here at the bottom of the page. I felt like the value change here would work beautifully, and decided I could do the same thing to fix the shirt in my painting. By re-wetting the plaid, it toned it down and made the shirt look soft and worn, which was exactly the effect I was going after. You can also see in this photo that the background had dried lighter than when it was wet, as watercolors tend to do. I felt like the value was too close to the man's shirt and face, so I wanted to make the background darker. I laid down pieces of blue masking tape to protect where I had already painted the figure, and then I applied some darker mixtures of the same colors I had painted in the background the first time. To do this, I dabbed the paint with these torn natural sponges. I dampened the sponges first, but I kept them relatively dry so the paint wouldn't be seeping under the blue masking tape. Using the sponges like this also helps to suggest the texture of foliage. When I removed the blue masking tape, I went ahead and hand painted the same darker colors right up around the man's wisps of hair. Here's a before and after. Can you see how the darker background now makes the main subject stand out better? Next, I completed the machinery, creating a variety of textures and colors to suggest its years of use. Here's how the masking fluid protected the beard. On the left, I ignored the masking fluid while I painted right over it. So when I pulled the masking off the paper, you can see on the right how it protected all those lines of hair along the edges of the beard. But sometimes the whites left by masking are too harsh, as they were here. So you can glaze over the white areas, or you can re-wet with clean water and rub around some color to soften them and blend them more naturally. It's good to have both hard edges and soft edges within a painting for emphasis and for contrast. This part of the shirt needed to be softened in its transition to the background. So I re-wet the edge where the two sections touched, and I gently rubbed around with a brush to blend the paints in that area. I'm nearing the finish now, but I can't resist a few last details. The 300-pound paper is thick enough to take some abrasion, so I used an X-Acto knife blade to scratch some fine lines in the painted area and make some of the white paper show again. And this made the effect of white hairs in his eyebrows. And here you have it, my finished watercolor of the sorghum maker, using a combination of basic watercolor techniques you might try in your own paintings. To see more of my watercolors, acrylic paintings, and scratch boards, I invite you to visit my website. While you're on my website, check out my blog, where I share lots of tips and techniques as I finish each new painting. And please visit and subscribe to my YouTube channel. As I continue to add more videos you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching.